Hello and welcome to another edition of Sustaining Sustainability. I am your host, CB Bhattacharya, and today it is my pleasure to welcome Mr. Piyush Gupta, who is the CEO and director of the DBS Group, a leading financial services group in Asia, who's joining us from Singapore. Piyush, amongst many other things, was also named to the list of the top 100 CEOs by the Harvard Business Review in 2019. Piyush, welcome to the program.
It's a pleasure to be on this podcast with you, CB. Thanks for having me.
So, Piyush, as you know, we are talking to people around the world, and today we hit Singapore. So, can you give us a sense of what life has been like in Singapore as the COVID-19 crisis has unfolded?
As you know, most of Asia, East Asia in particular, had gone through the SARS episode some 15 years ago. Most of the countries and the citizenry in this part of the world has some very vivid memories of that episode. And therefore, the playbook for most of these countries was fairly common and consistent. The good news, of course, is that the health systems in this part of the world are very good, in Singapore in particular. And therefore, even though we now have had some 19,000 cases, the mortality rate has been quite low. I think 19 deaths, which makes it 0.1%.
When you compare how organizations in Singapore have responded to the crisis to those in the other parts of the world, perhaps the US in particular, where I'm sitting today, what would be kind of one notable difference that you can call out?
Let me call out two. Not just a strong government role, but what I call a whole of nation approach to handling a crisis of this sort. So in Singapore's case, the whole crisis response is led by a task force at the ministerial level, but the entire administration, the Ministry of Health, the Ministry of Trade, the Ministry of Finance, the private sector, we all come together in various task forces to drive cohesive and cogent agenda. In financial services, for example, the governor of the central bank has a small group of 10 of us. We get together on a call once a week, and we create a systemic response program, which includes what we need to do for the citizenry, for customers, relief measures. It's very well orchestrated and tightly pulled together at a national level. So I'd say that is one big difference between here and other parts of the world. The second big difference, I would say, is the willingness to, for example, share data, personal data, around the testing, tracing, quarantining regime. But in these parts of the world, the notion that the needs of the collective, the society's requirements for putting this data together for doing tracking and tracing, for example, did not come into question at all. And it's quite clear that as you look at some of the more liberal democracies, there are a lot more questions about the appropriateness of doing that, and the trade-offs are debated a lot more actively. Certainly in this part of the world, the recognition that sometimes we, the collective, is more important than I, the individual, seems to play out a lot more easily.
So, Piyush, in 2019, when you were named by the Harvard Business Review to the top 100 CEOs, DBS Group was also named as one of the top 10 transformative organizations of the decade. What are you doing right now in the current COVID-19 era to help the situation?
CB, I guess at one level, what we are doing is fairly similar to a lot of other companies and countries, which is trying to think about how we create relief packages for customers and consumers at large, providing cash flow support, moratoriums on principal and interest payments, reducing charges and fees if we can. We came up with a program of providing free COVID insurance for over 1 million customers across the region and so on and so forth. We're also, like many other people, we're actively involved with relief works, medical kits, looking after migrant labor, the elderly, the disabled, etc. But I think more germane to your question, what distinguishes us in some ways is the digital capabilities that we have and that we have already rolled out. That's perhaps why we were named one of the most transformative organizations. Our capacity to provide digital access to customers is already been enhanced over the years. And this has really stood us in great stead. In fact, in the first 4 weeks of this crisis, we were able to accelerate many other plans we had. So our digital volumes have actually just gone through the roof. It's digital payments, it is opening of accounts, it is for things like migrant labor, it is even digital equity, digital FX, being able to do all your account services. Digital volumes are up by 2 to 3x over month on month. And this is obviously quite helpful in a situation where people are either by regulation or law not allowed to leave their houses. This has been, I think, extraordinarily helpful to our customers, apart from obviously helping us to continue to build our customer engagement and our business volumes. So that's on the one side. On the other side, these same digital capabilities allowed us to move into a work from home environment very, very swiftly. So we didn't frankly miss a beat in terms of getting almost all of our people to be able to work from home. And this included things like our technology development, it included supporting our production systems. And the fact that we're able to do that without any loss of productivity, actually the volumes we're handling right now are perhaps 10-20% more than they would be in a normal month. And we're doing this with no backlogs, no loss of productivity. I think that speaks in part to the digital capabilities that we do already have. Another thing that we've been able to do is leverage our data analytics and AI capabilities extremely well. So let me give you a couple of examples. On the 11th of February, we had our first case of virus in the bank. And within 24 hours, our AI team had been able to pull together a set of big data and AI-driven solutions, which leverage things like the Outlook calendar, meeting records, the Wi-Fi system within the bank, and used all that to pull together very quickly all first degree of separation cases from the infected person. And then after that, a second degree of separation, and then a third degree of separation. And on the back of that, we were able to create a protocol. So all first and second degree cases went into quarantine, and third degree cases were then subsequently monitored. Now, we back tested this against just talking to people, interviewing people, and having them try to remember who they had been in touch with or who else they could have infected. And the accuracy rate using data and analytics is at least twice as good as the accuracy rate of relying on human memory. So that's the capacity to be able to do that comes from the digital capabilities that we have. A second example was just to track adequate social distancing on a floor level. In addition to just visual oversight, we put sensors in all our floors. And so now the sensors are able to track and tell us actual count of people on the floor and the spacing of people on the floor. So we know whether we're running afoul of any social distancing measures. Again, the capacity to leverage technology intelligently is very helpful in putting together solutions of this sort.
How will banking and the financial industry kind of need to change in the wake of the COVID-19 crisis? Anything fundamental?
I think the digital part obviously will be very different, both for the way we do our work and the way customers interact with us. But I think companies and corporations have to be engaged in doing real things for real people. This whole agenda around stakeholder responsibility, not just shareholder responsibility, I think this is going to pick up even more steam. And one reason I think this will happen is because as we get out of this crisis, I fully expect to see a very significant social backlash. The reality is people are going to hurt. This is at heart a very human tragedy. The problem is everybody won't hurt equally. Some countries will do better than others, depending on their fiscal resources and prowess. Some industries will do better than others. If you're in a service sector industry, your goods, your demand for goods disappears permanently. If you have a hotel room and you don't rent out the hotel room, it's gone. If you're in a manufacturing space, you still have the capacity to go and make up lost volume. So some industries will suffer more than others. Small and medium enterprises will suffer a lot more than large companies because they're just a lot more prone to liquidity challenges which very quickly convert to solvency challenges. And frankly, this is a crisis of the poor. The people who are well off can still insulate themselves and get medical attention. It is the daily wage worker, the migrant labor, who's going to hurt a lot more. And that's going to push companies and banks to even more than ever focus on what is your true role? Why do you exist? And why are you relevant to society? Why are you relevant to the community at large? A second thing that will happen, I think, CB, people will start focusing on the tail risks a lot more. And these things can happen. And when they happen, they are boundaryless. And therefore, we better start thinking and preparing for some of these issues. So I think some of the naughty problems of society, some of the problems embedded in the SDGs will start getting some more attention. Third change that will happen is the recognition in society at large, in companies as well, that sometimes it is possible to take collective action and make short-term sacrifices for long-term good. And when I say this will happen is because this is what every company is doing today. Willy-nilly, whether through preference or through regulation, everybody is being forced into lockdown. That's a massive sacrifice. And it's a massive economic sacrifice. But for the capacity to be able to save lives. Now, people are going to take this way of thinking and transfer it to other domains. Just from a different lens, I also think that you will start seeing a more active role of government. And I think that will happen partly because there is increasingly a recognition that there are some public goods. And the nature of public goods is that you need some kind of governments or authoritative figures to drive an allocation process and a pricing process around those public goods. The whole idea that public health is so important in this crisis, and the only way you can bring it to bear is by having an active government. I think that's a lesson. But the other lesson will come from one other simple fact, which is the amount of financial resources being thrown at this problem, whether it is monetary policy-led or fiscal policy-led, will willy-nilly mean that the government will sooner or later have to be a lot more actively involved in the futures of a lot of companies. While right now there's a lot of debt financing being done, I fully expect over the next year or two that the governments will wind up having to take serious equity positions in many companies and private sector corporations. And when that happens, then you just wind up naturally with a more active role of the government. So I think that's another change you're going to see, and companies are going to have to start recognizing that reality and working with it.
What advice would you give to other financial business leaders who still haven't asked that question of what does a bank or a financial entity actually do? What is the true value they create?
Well, I always believe, CB, that for most of us, we get to operate on the back of two licenses. One license is a regulatory license. Some figure and authority, the government or somebody gives you a license to operate. But the second license that you need and you get is a license from civil society. That in the long term, civil society must believe that you bring value. And it's only with that belief that you get the right to exist over years and generations. And you cannot ever forget that. I think that's crucially important. I also believe that this perceived trade-off between shareholder value and stakeholder value is actually only a question of time frames. In the short term, sometimes it's a trade-off. Do you invest the next dollar into producing a better ROE, or do you invest it into creating some social good? But because I believe that you have to have a social license to operate, if you change the time frame to a longer term time frame, then that conflict disappears. Because the only way you can reward your shareholders consistently over the long term is you have to have the right to be there in the long term. And if you take that long-term view, therefore, looking after multiple stakeholders is actually the right thing to do for shareholders as well. And my last comment is this. It goes back to the earlier thought I had about social response coming out of this crisis. I think, as with all of these things, people are angry and people look for, who can they blame? In the 08-09 crisis, most of the blame fell on the back of the banking community, financial services. This time around, it's a little more tricky. In fact, sometimes banks are seen as agencies of good because they're distributing the government relief measures. Nevertheless, people will be looking for who to blame. And so I fully expect that you will wind up a year from now with a set of people who are heroes and a set of people who are villains. And it's going to be very easy to fall into the category of villains if you're not really, really thoughtful about what could make you a hero instead. This idea of making sure that you're very, very clear about why you exist, what role you play in your community, in the country, in society, I think that's going to be extremely important in making sure you get categorized in the preferred camp and not in the camp of being a villain.
What can individuals do to make our society better and move towards that collective that you mentioned earlier?
Well, I think the principal call I would make is a singular premise that each one of us can make a difference. It's very easy to be defeatist and figure you're going up against massive forces that are difficult to change. But in my own experience, every person counts and every voice counts.
Piyush Gupta, thank you so much for your time. It was an absolute pleasure to host you today.
Happy to be there, CB. Best of luck.
And before I sign off, I do want to say that this podcast is made possible by the help of my colleagues, Leslie Marshall, who's the Associate Director of the Center for Sustainable Business, and Alyssa Martinec, who is the Sustainability Coordinator of the Center for Sustainable Business. I'm your host, CB Bhattacharya, and I look forward to seeing you next week. Bye-bye.